22. We're talking today about the 2021-22 additional ABE funding allocation. A couple key starter notes. If you have any needs or tech help, please chat to Carla Vian. I'm so grateful today to have Literacy Action Network co-hosting this session with us, and so grateful for Carla for being our technical assistants. A little reminder for yourself, please check your name, and you can right click on your name to or on the three dots on your box to change your name, and please use your first and last name just like you would on a name tag. Also, please make sure to keep your mic and your video off during this time. We will have some group conversation later and large group conversation where you can share at that point. But if you're not currently muted, please mute yourself. You can do that by going to the bottom of your screen and hovering your mouse to reveal that toolbar. Okay, I think that it includes all of, also I want to make sure that you know about the closed captioning, and that's available in the toolbar, maybe under the three dots, the more option. Okay, I think that includes all of our technical assistance to get started. And so let's get going. I will also remind you that we are recording today's session, and that will be, the recording will be posted on the Literacy Action Network website. In today's brief session, we're going to do some introductions. We're going to provide an overview of the funding. Make sure we take time to answer your questions. Then we have there are some recommendations on how you could use the funding. Then we'll take some time for some large group conversation and some small group conversation where you can kind of chat with each other, like, what are you really going to do with the funding? Or what are you originally thinking? And so I think having some small group time will be very helpful. And then we'll talk some next steps. So let's start with introductions. Tom, do you want to start?
Hi, this is Tom Citron-Heisem, and I'm here in various capacities, mostly today representing Literacy Action Network.
Excellent, thank you. Carla.
Hi, I'm Carla Vian, and I'm the administrative assistant with Literacy Action Network, and I'll help you out with any tech kinds of issues that you might have. Just please private chat to me. Thanks.
Wonderful, thank you. And C.
Hi, Seymour Lesky. I'm the president-elect for LAN, and I am the program manager down at Southwest ABE.
Excellent, thank you. And I don't think Susan was able to join us today. Susan, you're not here, right? Okay, no. And so then from the Minnesota Department of Education, there's me, Brad Haskamp. I'm the State Adult Education Director. And joining me also sharing some of this work is Jody Versad. Jody.
Hi, everybody. Good afternoon. Good to see you. Yeah, like Brad said, I'm working together with him on this effort and kind of handling probably some of the logistical end of application details and stuff like that. So feel free to reach out to me in addition to Brad for those kind of logistical questions.
Thanks, Jody. Okay, so let's launch in and describe what funding we have available here. So there's $10 million. That is one-time funding for adult education providers using federal ARP or American Recovery Plan Act funding. And that funding is to build capacity and enhance services in adult education programs. Some ideas: local adult education programs could use this funding to help increase their programming statewide, help purchase equipment, devices, internet access hotspots for adult learners. Maybe that could be so to continue your distance learning work, or maybe to do more hybrid learning or high flex learning for your programming. Or you could provide more high school equivalency testing with this funding, or launch additional or more robust programming or models that are currently maybe too expensive with your current financial restrictions. And you can collaborate with workforce development partners, post-secondary institutions, and employers to expand your career services, navigation services, and integrated education and training programming to help adults either enter or re-enter the workforce. So let's talk about a timeline for this funding. So as early as Friday, I will be sending an application and the details to every consortium manager, and that will be via email. The applications are only being sent to consortium managers because we're accepting applications only from one per consortium. On June 18th, this is a tight turnaround. You'll have 2 weeks, 2 full weeks to complete that application. But we'll talk about what that application actually means. And instead of submitting this application via SERVS, this application will be actually submitted to us via email. That funding can start being used as of July 1st of this year. Throughout the next year, consortia can submit financial reporting as frequently as quarterly. We're asking that programs please do not invoice for this funding more than quarterly, more frequently than quarterly. And this invoicing will be very similar as how you would invoice for, say, the Integrated English Literacy and Civics grants. And so if you currently have one of those IELCE grants, this reporting or invoicing process will be similar. Currently, the last date to spend that funding is June 30th of 2022. However, please note that the Ministry of Education, we are working with the governor's office to see if we can extend that. Maybe to, currently the department is hoping that this funding could be extended out to August 31st of 2022. But stay tuned. What you will see in the application right now, because we haven't completed that negotiation, is likely right now it will say that the last day to use the funding is June 30th. But that extension may get approved. And then to be determined is the due date for final narrative and financial reporting, which will be a basic report that we'll be asking of each of you. So let's talk very briefly, and don't worry, we'll have some time for questions here in just a little bit. Let's talk about what will be in the application. It's important to know that this application will be a very simple application. It'll be nothing like the 5-year narrative, of course, nothing like the federal. Just please make sure you mute yourself when you enter the session. We're getting some feedback or background noise. This is meant to be a very simplistic application. What this application will include is contact information for those within the Adult Education Consortium, the amount requested based on the estimate, and I'll give you a little bit more detail there. A basic work plan, like how are you planning on spending that funding? And with that, a basic evaluation plan. How are you going to determine if that funding, how useful it was? And a proposed budget. How are you going to spend the money? All of those, the work plan, the evaluation plan, and budget, those are what you're initially proposing. They're meant to be fairly basic. You do not have to submit pages and pages. If your work plan and evaluation plan fit on one page, great. You do not need to develop like a 20 or 30 page work plan for this money, and just utilize the proposed budget similar to how you would be budgeting for adult education programming, like state and or federal funding. Now, I said before that we're going to be asking for the amount requested, and that means you'll have 3 options on the application that you submit. It'll be a checkbox, and you can check one of the 3. You're either going to say we accept all of the funding that is estimated to be given to us. We're going to accept some of the funding, and then you'll put a cap on how much money total you can accept maximum. And then none of the funding, saying maybe your consortium is saying we cannot spend any of this additional funding, and then you would say we'll accept none of that funding. So you'll have those 3 options. Like I mentioned before, this funding is not going through SERVS, but we will be distributed via SWIFT based on invoices from the consortium fiscal agent to the Minnesota Department of Education. And also please note that this funding needs to be tracked separately from your regular state and federal adult education funding. So I'm sure many of you are wondering, what's the amount? Like, what's my consortium's estimated amount? So we do have estimates that are available, and if you see in the chat, C has shared a link to a Google spreadsheet where you can see the different consortium estimated amounts. And these estimates are developed based on each consortium's current percentage or share of total state adult education funding. And so the state funding factors that contribute to that are your base population, the number of contact hours, your K-12 LEP rate or count, and the population in your area over age 25 that does not have a diploma. And those factors and all the state funding is based on fiscal year 21. So what you're receiving this current fiscal year, what share or percentage of total state funding your consortium is getting, that is how that estimate was determined. If a consortium is currently at one of those 2 state aid caps, don't worry, you will still get this additional state or this additional federal funding. And note that if you want to do a rough estimate on your own, you take a look at your total state aid this year and count 20% of that. That's similar to how this estimate was derived. And note that these are initial estimates. As I said before, in the application, each consortium will have the option of saying if they want to accept all of the money, some of the money, or none of the money. And so if there are consortia that accept some or none of the money, that means that any unused funding would go back to everybody else, and that could increase the amount that other consortia get that said that they want all of the money. And so consortia would receive an increased amount if other consortia do not accept the funding or accept that reduced amount. Let's take a quick look now at the estimates. I'm going to bring it over here. So this is what the estimate will look like. And let me increase the screen, the text. You can see a little bit more on what each consortium would get. And
Did
every
you print out
consortium,
copies of that? Yes. Okay. I need to go to Genio.
as you're
yeah.
online, please note we're getting some background noise. Please mute yourself if you're not currently muted. So here you can see every consortium in alphabetical order by consortium name, the consortium fiscal agent, the estimated amount, and then the consortium contact, first name, last name, and email. And so you can see here that we have consortia that vary quite a bit in size. So out of this $10 million in funding, the smallest consortia will receive over $5,000, but our largest consortia will receive about 1.5 million of the dollars. And that's just kind of showing the wide variety of consortia size we have here in the state of Minnesota. So you can take a look on this list and see where your consortium falls and what the current estimate looks like for your consortium. And you'll note out of that 10 million, we're only allocating 9.8 million. The reasoning for that is that 200,000 or 5% is for us to administer the grant. So a lot of that is paying for grant staff and or our staff time that we're using for this grant. So that is a little bit of everything that this estimate this is what the estimate looks like. And these estimates will actually be built into the application document when the applications are emailed out to the consortium managers, either on Friday of this week or Monday of next week. So that is a little bit about the estimates. So now I've shared a lot of information, a description of the funding, talking about the timeline, the application, as well as the estimated amounts. Let's open it up for questions. What questions do you have? Feel free to share your questions verbally by unmuting yourself, or you can share your questions in the chat. And hopefully C and Carla and Jody can help me catch all of the questions. So first question from Jason Sellers. What can this money definitely not be spent on? So in terms of restrictions, we're trying to be fairly open. And so the same restrictions that you'd have for your state and federal adult education money would likely apply to this federal money. Things including like 5% admin maximum would apply. That's similar to the federal funding. And other than that, you're pretty open, similar to how you develop your own adult education budgets. Obviously, if you say, I'm sending myself on a cruise around the world for the next 365 days, and so not, our entire consortium allocation will go to my travel costs, that would be restricted. We would say that that would not pass. But other than that, if it's true, if the budget looks like it's working towards building your adult education program capacity and enhancing your services, that would be generally approved from our office. We have another question.
Just one thing I might add for people to think about, that it's not really a legal requirement, but probably not the wisest thing to spend the money on recurring expenses because they won't be sustainable after this year. So it'd be really great for a program to give all our teachers raises and then have to take the raises back a year from now because the money went away. So building it, using it for capacity building type thing seems like the most intelligent and probably effective use of the money in general.
Good point. Yeah, so it is helpful to know what you absolutely can and cannot spend it on. And then also you might want to think about how you should or should not spend the funding. That's a great piece of advice because you don't want to get yourself in trouble a year from now because this is one-time funding. Great point, Tom. We have a question just kind of going back to that slide about the description of the funding. So I'll go back to that slide quick. So some ideas that this was originally in the state legislature in the House of Representatives. Well, if you've just joined us, please mute yourselves. We're getting feedback. Just take one more time.
Please mute yourself, Denise Center. Mute yourself.
Excellent. Thank you again, Susie. You are my excellent bouncer here today. So the description of the funding, again, this is one-time funding to build your program's capacity and enhance services. Local adult education programs could use this funding for increasing your programming statewide, purchasing equipment, devices, and internet access hotspots for adult learners, or maybe to build high flex programming, more distance ed, sustain more distance ed programming, or hybrid learning within your program. Maybe providing more high school equivalency testing. Maybe it's to help launch additional or more robust programming or models that are currently too expensive that you could try to make more affordable over the course of the next year. A little bit of experimenting. Also, how could you maybe thinking about how you could use this money to collaborate with your workforce development partners, build partnerships with your workforce development, career force, post-secondary institutions, employers, and others, so that you can expand your career services, navigation services, IET or integrated education and training programming to really help adults enter or re-enter the workforce. So that's, again, just a reminder of the description of the funding or the intent from the legislature and from the governor. Next, can someone help me with the next question? I see there's a lot that's been asked here.
Yeah, Brad, I'm wondering if I can kind of add to what you're saying a little bit in some of the questions that are coming up in the chat here.
Yeah.
So I think there's an important distinction between what Brad is saying and what Tom mentioned. So I think first we need to set a baseline understanding of what the funding requirements are, or restrictions, which I think the best way to think of that is these funds can be used for the same things that you already are using your state and federal ABE funding for. So anything that you currently can't spend that funding on, like taking a cruise around the world, you can't use this additional funding for. But we, like on the MDE end or at the governor's end, there is not a restriction on using this for sort of recurring expenses, or somebody, I think Lori is asking, making your budget whole because it's lower than it has been. There's not a restriction against doing that. I think Tom is just suggesting that we should all be thinking strategically about not creating problems in another year from now when we don't have this additional amount of funding.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you, Jody, for sharing. Yeah, for that reminder and that clarification. I know also Teresa's asking about the object code that's considered admin. That's UFAR's object code 110, which is an administrator that is not directly supervising adult education programming, but is maybe supervising the consortium manager. So community ed directors in some cases are higher if you're in a school district, or maybe some of your nonprofit executive staff or something like that. That would be that admin expense code is 110. And Kathy's asking about how about the cost for a literacy leader Vista? Yes, that would be definitely be an allowable use of the funding and a great way to build your program's capacity. Excellent. We have another question from Teresa just saying, thinking about reoccurring classes that might have additional hours that may generate or may increase funding in future years if we end up getting contact hours this year. And so the question is, we know there's also that committee or the contact hour working group, and any updates on their work so far. And we've had 2 meetings thus far with this group, and we've been learning a lot about the funding formula, and we have been exploring ideas and brainstorming potential solutions and recommendations. But at this point, that committee has at least two additional meetings to really create a finalized recommendation. So very similar to last year, there will likely be a recommendation that will be able to be released either around Summer Institute or in early fall. And so continue to look for that. And that committee is really tasked with making sure they're looking at all of your consortia around the state and seeing what is the fairest solution in terms of contact hour reporting. Some folks have said, ideas have been thrown out, like maybe we continue one more year to reuse Table A1 funding, or maybe we have some sort of split year, or maybe we do some combination of merge funding. There's a lot of ideas going out there, but the committee is not yet settled on any recommendations, and they're not yet ready to share any of those recommendations because we need to do some additional research, do some additional modeling, kind of think these ideas out a little bit more and clarify them so that we can share them with you. Getting a little bit of background noise again, so if you're not muted, please mute yourself. I'm looking at you, Dwayne.
Dwayne Gates, please mute yourself. Dwayne Gates.
Okay.
Another question, do the funding requirements actually say about not spending or reoccurring expenses? Oh, and I think Jody clarified that there's the difference between the absolute restrictions, but also there's that should. So what you generally can spend your money for adult education programming, state and federal funding, you can use this funding for. And then question from Michael about, would you spell a little bit more about what type of navigation services are allowable? So with any state and federal adult education funding, navigation services are something that programs at times have funded, especially maybe with their career pathway programming. Maybe though, it's not actually funding it yourself, but helping to get a partner on board, like maybe a career force center counselor or a nonprofit or social service agency counselor that can provide some of those wraparound services with your career force programming or with some of your other students, and making sure that they are able to navigate not the adult ed system, but like those other systems that we're partnering with, post-secondary, workforce, etc. And so like utilizing those resources is an allowable expense. Another question is about, can funding be spent on PPE, personal protective equipment related expenses? Yes, that is also an allowable expense. Okay, C, Tom, Jody, any other questions, or are we ready to move to the next section?
I think you got them all, Brad.
Excellent. Don't worry, there will be more time for conversation and questions yet, but let's go to the next slide. I'm going to turn it over to C and Tom.
So Len and I, we had some discussions. We met the week right after we found out that we were going to be getting this money, and we kind of made a list for everybody, some recommendations for how to use this money. So remember, as Brad was saying, this funding is for capacity building, not for general operating, because you don't want to kind of support something that you already have and then it is no longer sustainable. Because when we go back to legislators, we want to tell them success stories that we had, that we piloted something and it worked. We don't want to say, well, we use our money up to pay staff and now we have no programming, we don't know what to do. So definitely take this time to pilot some programs that you haven't done before. You know, this was mainly meant for some programming, but they're extending it through the year. So take this opportunity to kind of take some of those risks and try it out. Funding should be used to develop and strengthen services. So for instance, I know I saw a lot of people were in there about technology. So maybe this is a time to get new computers for your computer lab so you have better technology for your students. Funding should be tailored to local needs and conditions. So what will best benefit your local adult education population? So what I have down here in Marshall is not going to be the same as what I have in the metro. So I might need to look at maybe, you know, more childcare or transportation, you know, and metro, they don't really need that, not the childcare part, the transportation part. And also developing, implementing a strategic plan could be beneficial use of funding as well too. So, you know, maybe you need to come up with a plan of, okay, what are we going to do so that we're not going to be in the same place again? Because I think of with the contact hours and everything, that this is a time to try things and see what we can do to increase those hours. And then just remember that the statewide support services providers do provide a lot of resources in your areas, including TVM training. So that's maybe a good time to get your teachers TVM trained. Distance learning, digital navigation, and navigator training. So look at all their lists. They have a ton of different trainings. And again, this might be the perfect time to get your staff trained in all these areas before that you couldn't get trained because you didn't have the money to send your staff training.
Excellent. Thank you, C. And then Tom.
Hi, there is obviously some overlap with some of the things that LAN itself suggested. But one of the things that we have all experienced is just the really tremendous need in terms of distance learning and digital literacy, which has affected all of our programs. So the DL support team spent a little bit of time thinking about what might be a good use of some of that money to help programs build in those areas. And some of the things we came up with is the TVM process, because it takes time for teachers to get trained and to actually develop those resources, but those resources can then be used ongoing. So adding some hours to staff to do that kind of work can be really helpful. Having inadequate computer and technology resources, especially directly for students in their homes, is a huge ongoing need in many parts of the state. So getting students computers that students can either check out or earn or something like that would be very helpful. And then assuming there will be significant services on site, also upgrading the technology and computer resource labs at the various program sites could also be useful. And then finally, the need for digital navigation continues. And so I know that Literacy Minnesota has some good training for digital navigation. So a program might decide to start a digital navigation program, maybe using volunteers, maybe temporarily hiring a part-time coordinator to manage those volunteers, getting them some training, and then deploying a program model that could be used ongoing with students, using volunteers to help them learn how to use the computer, navigate the internet, and use distance learning resources that are available in the state. So we're putting our heads together, and we'll come out with some further suggestions that we'll send out probably in an article in the newsletter in the near future.
Excellent. Thanks, Tom. And that's a good reminder that there's multiple types of navigation. Also, the digital navigation is yet another type of navigation service that we found really valuable for that programs have been offering this past year. Eric Nessheim says in the chat, just also keep your eyes open for other groups giving out computers and internet. Maybe at the count, maybe that could be counties or other types of organizations or entities. There is a lot of money flowing right now. Eric wants to remind the rest of the group. So let's open this conversation up a little bit. We're going to start here with some large group conversation, and then we're going to split out into small group conversations. So right now, I want to hear from some of you. What initial ideas do you have on how you could use this funding for your consortium? And, you know, Karen Walters, you've been sharing a little bit here or there at times. Would you mind unmuting yourself and kind of sharing a little bit of what you've been thinking?
Sure. So I was at the meeting last week with the legislative committee, and so I've had a little time to think through some of this. And I haven't gone to our leadership team yet, but off the top of my head, some of the things that we have been talking about is really thinking about how can we ramp up things in the consortium to be prepared to offer both DL and face-to-face, and how will that look? And I've been talking about this for a long time. How am I going to offer both? We don't have the funding to offer both. And so we want to pilot things this year that will help us get to that place by next year. So we talked about high flex learning, which is basically having people in your classroom and then live streaming what you're doing to a group that might be at home at the same time. And order for us to do that, we need some equipment that would stream that instruction. And we also need, and we have it now, the capacity to train students on how to do that. We've already set ourselves up for that, so I don't need to fund that out of this money, but I do need some equipment in our classrooms so that we could do that. Specifically some swivels that would record and stream what's going on in the room. We also give money to PCs for People, and then we have our students go to PCs for People and get their machines so that we don't have to be handing out machines, collecting machines, chasing machines down. So we don't do a one-to-one device for our adults in our district, only the K-12 does that. So this will allow us to give money to PCs for People again, and we want to fundraise everything to do that. So we'll do some of that. I'm going to increase my summer school programming, and I need to increase one section in the day and one section at night and a couple of paras. So I will be doing that just for this summer. And that's because we had a large group of migrant workers move into our area. And so we need to increase our summer programming anyway. I'm going to TVM train all of the teachers that want to in our program, which is significantly, that's probably going to be more than a dozen teachers. Our district has decided to change some of our late start days, and we used to just do a small PLC on the late start days, but there are going to be some full days off in our district this year for staff development time, and our district has cut any staff development funding that we get from them. They've been generously giving us staff development funding for some time, and now they're not because they're in a budget crisis. So I will be able to reinstate all of the distance learning type training that we've been doing. I cut that for next year. So I'm going to bring that back into the budget so that we can keep our teachers up to date with distance learning and any kind of training we want to do. I need to upgrade my computer labs. I was trying to figure out how am I going to do that. We have everything kind of on a rotating schedule. And so this will help me make sure that our technology is up to date. We have a remote, not a remote. We have a mobile lab, like a set of laptops and a desktop lab that will need to be upgraded throughout these 2 calendar years we're crossing. So I can do that. And in order to do that high flex programming in the school year, we aren't sure how that's going to look. What I imagine is that the classrooms where I have high flex going on, I'm probably going to need to have an extra paraprofessional in each classroom. And what I would like to do is pilot and get people used to that type of instruction, but then see if at some point we could have maybe one para between 2 classrooms eventually. So at first, I think we're going to be staff heavy and we're going to be training heavy. And as time goes by and people get used to it and we decide which classes would be appropriate for high flex programming, then we can start to look at how can we share those paras and get back to kind of a normal level by next year. So I have a lot of planning and a lot of ideas, but I feel thankful that I've heard about this a week earlier because knowing the short time frame we have to turn around, it's going to be tight to get to the staff, get ideas, and turn that application around by the 18th. Thanks, Brad.
Yeah, thank you, Karen. I really appreciate that kind of robust thinking and thinking about multiple facets of the programming and really trying to experiment with some new models. So maybe some staff hours are increased as you're trying to provide more high flex temporarily and until you kind of get into more efficient or sufficient mode. And also just getting everyone utilizing that funding and the resources for training and getting everyone TVM certified, because that could help the program long term. I think that kind of robust plan sounds like a great idea.
I forgot to mention one other thing that Ann Trokel and I have been talking. Ann supervises a program that's probably roughly 2 hours away from Mankato. They're in our region, Glacial Lakes, which is Wilmer Hutchinson. And we have done some regional classes through our regional transitions funding. And we want to meet with our regional managers in Southwest and really just talk through what could we do regionally for night programming, because all of us have found out that night programming, well, a lot of people across the state have found out that night programming has been well received as an online synchronous Google Meet thing or Zoom thing. And we have a lot of students in Mankato and they have some in Hutchinson that don't want to give that up. But we don't have like a lot of levels at night. We have probably 2 or 3 levels, where during the day we can have up to 5 levels in Mankato. And so we were talking about, how could we work together and pool our resources to offer like a program of all the levels, but fund it together so that our students could enroll in each other's levels. We just don't know how we can do that, but we really want to just talk about that and explore how could we do something that would create a little bit more of a robust night program between 2 or 3 consortia. And I'm thinking about some of the consortia up north who are really big geographically and have lots of little sites. Doing that within your own consortium would be way easier than going across consortia. I have one site in Mankato and another site a half an hour away. So it's easy for me to do that. But I'm thinking of like some of the big geographically, but small numbers, where you don't have a critical mass to offer. You're doing like a 1-room schoolhouse in multiple cities. Even Lee Sewer is like that, multiple areas having classes and everybody's teaching them, one is on Tuesday night, one is on Wednesday night, one is on Thursday night in all these different cities with different teachers. If you could figure out how to offer a Zoom class to all of your sites and have one teacher serve that, building the capacity for how would you do that? What would be the process for enrolling people at all of those places and getting them onto a class that you could offer so that you have a critical mass of students? That would be an idea I would pursue if I was in a different consortium. My consortium isn't really like that, but that's kind of what we're thinking as regionally of doing. It's just going to be way more complicated across consortia, I think.
Yeah, that's really true. But I think that's an important thought, is thinking about how you could work together with your neighbors or maybe as a region to kind of collaborate on programming to best utilize those resources. So it's not everyone duplicating their efforts, especially if the classes are not of a size where they're financially sustainable long term. Absolutely. I think that's a great idea. And like you say, Karen, it's also really complicated to work out. But maybe these additional resources, it's a great time and a great opportunity to explore it. Excellent. I know in the chat, I don't know if C or Tom or Jody would like to help me with the chat. I know there's been some questions going on in the chat about programs maybe purchasing, not for a loan of equipment to students, but actually giving students technology potentially. And so a couple programs responded there. saying things such as, let's see, Renata was saying that students can earn a laptop to keep with a certain number of distance learning hours. But we have to fundraise for that because our district does not let us spend money on technology that students get to keep. That makes sense. And C was also saying that they partnered a while back with a few other organizations to refurbish donated and outdated computers that were donated. And when those students completed computer skills classes with us, they received that computer to keep. And also just kind of acknowledging that, yes, you're only going to get 2 weeks. It's a tight turnaround time from the time that we send out the application to the time that that's due. That's why we've really simmered it down to just a basic work plan, basic evaluation. How are you going to decide if the funding was well spent, and the budget, your initial budget? And note, all of those can change because we know this is a short time and this is just early in the year. You know, you might, as you get more further down the road into this next year, maybe you realize you need to adjust your budget, or maybe you want to experiment with a new type of programming model, or maybe you want to tackle HighFlex, but you weren't ready for it initially when you developed this work plan. That's okay to adapt along the way to best utilize the resources for your purpose.
There are several questions about whether these funds could be used to provide childcare while learners are in classes.
Yeah, so that would be very similar to whether or not you can use adult education, state and federal funding for childcare. And so that is allowable to use some of that funding for childcare purposes. That is allowable.
Brad, another question that's coming up, or that Teresa is asking, is about the restriction on giving away computers. And yes, Teresa, you are correct that I think it was Renata that mentioned that. So that must be a St. Paul district level restriction. We do not, the funds you receive from MDE do not have that restriction. There's no restriction against purchasing devices and giving them to students.
Thank you, Jody. Anything else I'm missing here? But I wonder if now would be a good time, actually, because we're getting a lot of ideas. You're getting a lot of great ideas of what you're going to do. So this might actually be a great time to merge into or divide into our small group conversation, giving everyone about 10 minutes in their breakouts. In your small groups, you're going to talk about kind of your initial ideas on the funding. Also, though, is your consortium going to accept all of the funding, maybe some of the funding, or none of the funding? Just your guess right now, and a little bit of your rationale there. In a small group, just also maybe you want to talk about what do you need to do to make a plan on using the funding as a consortium? And are there ways you could collaborate and work with other consortia, your neighbors, or as a region, or other consortia, just to get ideas or to best utilize the funding? So we can, Carla has been setting up our breakout groups, and I think those are kind of the guiding questions, and give you just a chance to talk with each other about what are you thinking right now, in case you have some ideas that you don't feel comfortable sharing with all of us or everybody else at the moment. It's always more fun to talk as a small group. So, so Carla, are we ready to divide into small groups?
Yeah, I think we're ready to go.
Okay, well, let's launch them. We'll give everyone 10 minutes in their small groups.